what speaks to this is a quote from Henry David Thoreau, who writes, "As a single footstep will not make a path on the earth, so a single thought will not make a pathway in the mind. To make a deep physical path, we walk again and again. To make a deep mental path, we must think over and over the kind of thoughts we wish to dominate our lives." And what he's, in essence, I mean, this speaks perfectly to the teachings that we're looking at, is that the kind of consciousness that you cultivate determines the kinds of consciousness that more readily arises. This is why the quote-unquote effort of practice also, as it's attended by effortlessness, it's important to practice, right? To put our efforts into practice to a degree, in order to cultivate this new pathway. And we know this to be true through the science of neuroplasticity, that there are three things that research says can change your brain, and I add a fourth one in there. The first one is repetition. Yeah. The second one is intensity, that the more intense an experience is, the more sort of imprinted you become with that change. The third is time, that there is a sense over time that these things arise. And then the fourth, the part that I add in, is motivation. Because I don't know how you can possibly do the first three without sort of the vigilance that arises out of good motivation. This is why we do the bodhicitta prayer at the beginning. Motivation helps vigilance. And without it, forget about the first three. So anyway, so this actually changes neural pathways. We can create it, but that doesn't mean it's easy. And I don't think that encountering or realization of freedom is easy when we are in the world. It's fine if you're in a monastery and you're on retreat. Man, that is like the conditions are ripe for it. But part of what we're doing here with Freedom Attending Reality is that we are in the world. Yeah? We are encountering violence and oppression and injustice and, just a really divided nation and all of that. And so rather than waiting for the conditions to be perfect, for freedom to arise, so we can say, okay, now it's peaceful and I can bring freedom to the world, or I can receive it from the environment I'm in, is we're being tasked with cultivating freedom that attends to the reality itself that we're around. So in a way, we can call this the warrior spirit, or we can call this activism, sacred activism, but either way, this is the task that we're being assigned in many ways. And so, to do this requires some real thoughtfulness, some contemplation, and some study, and some practice. And ultimately, as we'll see in a couple of weeks, the path itself, that our lives are the path. The path isn't one tiny part of it, but it makes up the entire context in which we do everything else, whether we realize it or not. And so, but we're not there yet. We're getting there. Today, speaking to this, and this Thoreau quote really speaks to impermanence. It speaks to change. So, so moving into sort of that theme, how do we actually encounter this very core teaching in Buddhism of impermanence? And we may know it intellectually, but how does the view, and here I'm perhaps sort of speaking against Longchenpa by saying our view matters. And I don't think he would disagree with the notion that we have to realize the nature of impermanence is utterly ubiquitous. And so in the framework of Tibetan Buddhism, we have this thing called the Four Seals. Has anyone heard of the Four Seals? What this is? This is not a sort of a mammal you find on the beach in Santa Barbara, but it is rather, or a family of them, but rather these seals are things that reflect ultimate truths, about the nature of all phenomena. And so the first is that basically all composite things, all existing things are subject to these four seals. The first seal Now we can't stop thinking of the animals, I know. Um, the first seal is the seal of impermanence itself. Yeah. Anicca, anicca, Anicca. Anicca means impermanence. It's specifically, that's the Pali word for impermanence. That all things are in constant perpetual change. And we may know this to be true, but that's kind of binds us up in a bit, in a way. Impermanence. If you think about impermanence, if I just say the word, what comes to mind? For a lot of people, it's loss or death. And we've done this on retreats before. Some of you might remember, I think Marie, like what, 12 years ago, I think we did an impermanence retreat in Dedham at the, can't remember the Westwoods, I think. Anyway, the center of Westwoods, beautiful place. And that was one of the first things we did was say, okay, what comes to mind when you think of impermanence? So for a lot of people, it has to do with loss. Yeah, not everyone. Some people say creativity. Yeah, um, new things and all of that, which is good. The truth of impermanence here is really specifically that in Buddhism, the philosophical structure of Buddhism, all things arise in dependence upon conditions and causes, or causes and conditions. All things gather because of the conditions that cause them to gather, and they disperse naturally because those conditions change. And then the elements that go into whatever has arisen, those disperse according to the changing circumstances. And this is seen, and we are like this too, you know. I am this sort of aggregate of uh, elements, of things, and of thoughts and energy. And one day I will disperse too. I won't be here anymore. Not in this form, anyway. And this poses us with problem, right? Number one, if we are ignorant of impermanence, we believe in the permanence of things that are horrible. We believe in the permanence of suffering, because suffering too is constantly changing. I mean, there's always a new form of it. You know? And so we get stuck by feeling as if permanence is permanent. Suffering is going, this particular form of suffering will be permanent. We also get stuck that we don't want to lose the things that we are clinging to. We don't want to say goodbye to friends. We don't want to have things die or decay, or we want a moment to last forever. And so impermanence can also be loss. So we go between this loss and this denial. Yeah. And rather than, and some of this is natural. Grieving, I think, is a very, very natural first arrow experience. So there are the two arrows of suffering. Suffering is like being shot with two arrows. Pain, the first arrow is pain, yeah, of being in a body that is subject to illness and death, and that we can't do anything about that. But the second arrow is the mental anguish that comes with the first arrow, and that is something we can work with. And this is where freedom is possible, is working with the second arrow in the midst of the first arrow. I feel like grieving losses of things that are precious to us, of people we love, is so natural that it's part of first arrow. It's part of the inevitability of uh, of loving and of leaving. You know? So, but what if we, our view, allowed impermanence to also be generativity, creativity? That there is always uh, a generative part of impermanence. And if all things are impermanent, as are all of the troubles that we see, yes, we may century after century be dealing with many of the same things at the center of the human heart. But there is also simultaneously this generative quality of creativity and potential to help us rebalance. So thinking of impermanence as generative because of the nature of change, and it is energized. It is constantly moving after all. There has to be something impelling that impermanence. So impermanence is also energy in movement, in motion. And it is potentiality. In other words, impermanence allows for the unborn to manifest in whatever form. Energy is active, it's activity. And therefore, our lives are always in process, constantly in process. Our collective lives are constantly in process, even as concretized and seemingly intractable many of the things are that we live by, and some of the ignorance that we might share or we might acknowledge together. But this concept of life being in constant change, Longchenpa tells us reality is actually free of all delimitation. This is the true nature of things. Now, we may not live this out because we are both individually and collectively subject to our neural pathways. That's very hard to change. And yet, there is potential here through cultivation. This is why meditation has been important to many of us. This is where change is possible. So that's the first thing about this notion of impermanence. The other part of impermanence is that we're all in this boat together. We are all subject and helpless to impermanence. And so, isn't that a good reason to have profound compassion for each other? Not just poor me. I am an impermanent being. How terrible for me. Yeah. No, we are all in this boat together. I don't care who is sitting next to you on an airplane that may be irritating the heck out of you. They too are helpless to that. Um, so the first seal, impermanence. The second seal is suffering, dukkha. Yeah. And it arises because of that first seal. Impermanence leads to suffering. Whether we deny impermanence and feel like our suffering is permanent, at least this particular kind of it, or we are suffering loss, the loss of change. Then the third seal comes in, which is non-self. So here it's that the view helps open things up a bit. Non-self, that all of these things, including ourselves, are sort of have no necessary enduring permanent conceptual existence. All of what we are, and including all the things we think and all the things we cling to, have no inherent permanent conceptual existence. And I add in the word conceptual because of how much this is really there to impact how we see. It doesn't mean that, it's this notion of Chris is empty of inherent nature. He doesn't necessarily feel it that way all the time. But ultimately, there is no concept of Chris. There is no Chrisness in me. There are qualities. There are correlates, if you will, to what it means to be this aggregate of things called Chris. But ultimately, Chris himself, in whatever form, will disperse too. Now, that doesn't mean he disperses into nothingness, which is kind of a bit misleading in some cases in Buddhism. This notion of non-self doesn't mean that there is no experience there or an experiencer. In fact, the profundity of openness and of luminosity of mind, when it is free of all concepts and beliefs and dogmas, if you will, is the ultimate free state. And yet there is a deep, profound experience in that, but you can't place it. This is why Longchenpa has these four qualities of what he calls samaya. Ineffability is one of them. Freedom is ineffable. It can't be named or called out. Actually, Chris himself is rather ineffable. This is not something I'm proud of because I would like to label myself sometimes. And then most of the time, I hate labels and I don't want to label myself. Nonetheless, underlying all of this, there is this ineffable quality of being. Openness is the second one. I'm still working on that one. Openness, yes, especially in the heart. And we'll be looking at that next week. We'll be doing fierce compassion as the sixth stage. The third is presence, really this profoundness of presence of awareness. What we can also look at as a hosting presence, that which is fully inclusive and spacious. And then the fourth is unity or oneness. And these four qualities are what Longchenpa tells us are very important. Samaya of Dzogchen. Dzogchen being this great perfection or this cultivation, if you will, of mind. So the third seal being non-self, it doesn't mean nothingness or an utter vacuum. In fact, that's impossible. Even quantum mechanics tells us that there is no such thing as anything vanishing completely. Things disperse into other forms, but there is no vacuum created when something disperses. And there is no such thing as a vacuum anyway, and not even in space as we're realizing. So let's see ourselves in change, not necessarily as the ego would have us believe that there is a good reason to fear annihilation, but rather switching that to there's a good reason perhaps, or maybe not so good reason to fear change, because we really either like who we are or we don't believe that we can let go of the things that we don't like. So part of this is also interdependence. That if we think about conditions coming together, interdependence, all things, including us and each other, we rely on each other and we rely on the factors that bring things into being. Now, that doesn't always appear in harmony with maybe other factors and other conditions, but from a philosophical standpoint, it's important, I think, to have that realization that we are interdependent, even if we don't believe we're dependent on the people we disagree with or we don't like. There is still an interdependence happening. Isn't that a lovely thing to be stuck in? It's almost like I didn't choose my family, but I also didn't choose my society. Maybe we can. I don't know. So again, the first of the four seals, the first three: impermanence, suffering, non-self, and the fourth, at the heart of what Longchenpa is telling us, what is sometimes called emptiness. I like to think of it as profound openness. Um, Emptiness brings us back into that sticky rabbit hole of nothingness, which is really not the case, but rather this realization of where we began on these seven stages, naked awareness. And so in this case, this quality of profound openness or profound presence, that is the fourth seal, becomes a companion to all of the changes, the causes and conditions that are arising and dispersing. And here's the compelling part. This becomes the changeless. We are at that point abiding in the changeless. Or as the Buddha says in his 10th discourse in the teaching of mindfulness, abiding in continuous mindfulness so that the stream isn't broken any longer by being mindful and mindless, mindful, mindless, mindful, mindless. This is, I don't know about you, this is me on an average day. A little mindful here, mindless over here, mindful, now I'm mindless. Yeah, we go. But a continuum of mindfulness, because then we are able to abide in this changeless quality of naked awareness and ultimately of freedom itself. So those are the main points here around impermanence. Impermanence is that opening, I think, into many of the Buddhist teachings. In fact, these four seals contain all the teachings within them in one way or another. So this is how important the four seals are. In Theravada Buddhism, in the tradition of the Shravakayana, the vehicle of not the Mahayana, the more monastic form of Buddhism, it's seen as three points. They don't have emptiness included there. It's called the Tri Lakshana, or the three marks, but they're largely the same. Yeah, impermanence, suffering, and non-self. So Tibetan Buddhism, Mahayana, brings in the fourth of shunyata, or what's often translated as emptiness. So let's let that be good news and not get mired by the state of the world, the turbulence, the chaos. Yes, there is suffering profoundly, but we also have to believe in possibility because of the nature of change and the nature of potentially and awakening what is unborn. Yeah. Our little moment in time here, there's a lot, it feels like there's a lot at stake. And yet, in the midst of this little moment in time, there is also profound freedom that can clearly see sort of the bigger arc in which we're existing. So when we're reading the news, when we're sort of caught up in what's happening in the Supreme Court or wherever, keeping freedom as part of that bearing witness so we don't get dragged back down the slippery slope of our own mind. Doesn't mean we don't act or attend, but we are coming from a deeper place to do so.